just shared in my September reading recap on my YouTube and podcast, but in it I talked about the book, The Poet and the Silk Girl, as a Japanese American that was born here to parents who immigrated from Japan. I acknowledge I have a very different history and experience from those with family that have been in the US for multiple generations. I have been to Japantown in San Jose, walked through the internment camp section in the Japanese American Museum, but when I read this book, it was a very different, eye-opening in so many ways to really hear this firsthand story of a family that lived through the heart of really hard things that have happened to Japanese Americans. So it is my great honor to be able to welcome the author, Satsuki Ina, today to talk to me about her book and so much more. Satsuki is a psychotherapist now specializing as a consultant in community trauma. She helps victims of oppression to claim not only their voice, but also their power to transform the systems that have oppressed them. Her activism has included co-founding Tsuru for Solidarity, a nonviolent direct action project of Japanese American social justice advocates working to end detention sites. She has produced 2 Emmy Award-winning documentaries about the World War II incarceration of Japanese Americans, Children of the Camps, and From a Silk Cocoon. She has also been featured in a lot of great places: New York Times, LA Times, Time, Democracy Now!, and the documentary And Then They Came for Us. In her recent memoir, newly released in paper book, The Poet and the Silk Girl, a memoir of love, imprisonment, and protest, has now been expanded to include a study and discussion guide too, to further discussions among the community. She was a professor emeritus at California State University, Sacramento, and she lives in the San Francisco Bay Area, which I also have deep ties to. So welcome, Satsuki.
Yeah, thank you, Amy. Thank you so much for having me.
It's an absolute pleasure to have you. I know I listed off a lot of your work and accomplishments, but is there anything you want to start out sharing with our audience about your story for those that are meeting you for the first time?
Yeah, I think one of the reasons why I'm willing to do something that's uncomfortable for me, like showing up on your program, is because, the Japanese American World War II incarceration story still lives in our community, and yet it's not known by the general public. And so, the importance of writing the book, of speaking out, is my contribution to educating the broader public about how democracy can go sideways. And with the current circumstances in our government today, I feel like it's really important to remind people what happens when the Constitution is violated.
And as I planned for our talk, I had such a hard time thinking of where to even begin because, to your point, there is so much that has happened in the past. There's so much that is going on now. There's so much to unpack because I went through so many emotions as I read your book of anger and fear and heartbreak, but also hope. So I think I want to start with just setting the scene for this haunting place in history where so many Japanese Americans, including your parents, were taken away to internment camps during World War II with very little notice, losing everything they had, regardless of citizenship. It didn't matter. And you were born in this space. So how did you come to process that part of your story as you grow older? And how does that look like for you?
Well, it took a long time for me to get to a place to even begin processing, because I think that a trauma response is to ward off re-experiencing the trauma. And so trauma memories get stored in a different way. And I feel like people like my generation complain that their parents never talked to them about the incarceration experience. And I tell them that my understanding is that because I interviewed many people and asked them, why did you never speak to your children about what happened? And there were 3 basic responses. One is they wanted to protect their children from the emotions of anger and despair that they experience, but also that they felt like it was too painful to recount what happened to them. They wanted to forget about it and move on. And then the psychological aspect of it is that in order to function, the person manages their memories and their experience about the trauma, and makes it unconscious, makes it in some ways inaccessible. So it's a coping response that I think many of our elders had.
How did you evolve through your life and your work? I know you chose the profession that you did. How did you come to choose that and do all the work that you do? Because there's, a lot of activism and speaking out that you now do. But I know that is not a natural thing, as you share in your book too, and I think culturally too, you mentioned this in your book as well, is very aligned to Japaneseness of not, not
Yeah,
causing a stir.
right, right. And so only when I'm 82 now, so when I look back, I can see a progress, a process that I wasn't aware of it as it was happening. I think one of the, I didn't understand what had happened. I could feel something in my family. And many people say it feels like there's a ghost that is ever present, that is infused with anxiety. There's some kind of danger. And so things like having to get perfect grades, being a good citizen, never, causing any problems, I think is part of Japanese culture, but also overlaid with the trauma response. So, I think my earliest experience in kind of opening that protected, transmitted trauma was when I was in college. I was at UC Berkeley, and it was the beginning of this free speech movement, actually the beginning of the civil rights movement. And my parents, and the students were protesting, demanding that, you know, faculty and students be able to speak out about issues in this particular area where speeches were made. And so students were getting arrested and dragged off to the jail. And my parents would call me every night and say with great alarm, we saved up our money so you could go to college. You need to go to class. We do not want to see your face in the newspaper. And I was like shocked because I'd never heard them speak like that before with so much direct demands. So, I remember walking to class. I didn't have any intention of participating in the protests, but somehow now it seemed like there was something really significant about it. So anyway, I was walking to class as I agreed with my parents, I'll go to class. And all the other students are walking the other way, going to the place where they're speaking out. And I get to my classroom, and there's maybe 3 or 4 other students in a class of maybe 100 students. And we're sitting there waiting, and all of a sudden the door flings open, and the professor comes running down the aisle and jumps on top of the desk and turns around and looks at us and says, "God damn it, if you show up in class, I'm going to flunk every single one of you." I was so shocked. And I walked out of there kind of numb, like caught in this bind. And that afternoon, my mother said, "You need to come home. We have to talk." So that's when I had the first conversation I ever had with my mother and my father. And that's when she said, "We never told you this, but, your dad and I renounced our American citizenship while we were in prison." And she was very tearful. And I said, why didn't you tell us about that? And she said tearfully, "We thought you'd be ashamed of us." And I always tell people, You have to imagine, I'm probably in my tie-dyed shirt and I've got long hair and maybe a braid across my forehead, and I'm looking at her and I said, we wouldn't be ashamed of you, Mom. I'm proud of you. And we both broke down and cried. And
I'm getting teary just hearing the story.
it was
Yeah.
so unearthing, the emotion and the bind that she was in, and also kind of it it cleared some of the fog from the sense that something had happened that I didn't really understand. And so that was the first moment, really, when my mother disclosed that. And I tucked it away. I felt like there was value in the protest that was going on, because that apparently was what my parents had to do, was to begin to protest, and their renouncing their citizenship was an indication of that they had no hope for their children in the world, that they would be incarcerated indefinitely for not having committed any crime. Yeah.
Mhm. So I know that shaped your journey, and I'm sure it was an evolution of you being able to speak up for yourself and for others as well. What did that look like, and how did it come into your parenting as well as you? I know we're spanning a large part of your life,
It's okay.
but you became a parent as well, and all of this carries in, right? Our experiences shape us into the parents we become too. So what did that look like for you as you started to find your voice?
Yeah, I still hadn't labeled what was directing me or what was guiding me, but I found myself drawn to do things. Like I volunteered at the Napa State Hospital, and as a student volunteer, we're supposed to just assist patients there. Uh, but what I started to do is to do this. I couldn't have called it analysis at that time, but to see the mistreatment that was going on, the dehumanizing that was happening, and got more involved confronting that. Um, the over medication and things like that. And I didn't create any massive change or anything, but I did advocate for individual patients and found that was not exciting necessarily. It was frightening because I had to speak out in ways I wasn't comfortable with. But I think that position that I found myself in, with this lens of injustice, or later could call it oppression, became the way that I would see things. And I had two sons, and I was a single parent for most of their lives. And I think how it affected my parenting was, and they're very gifted and they have accomplished wonderful things. My younger son is a graphic novelist and has
I've
had,
seen his work. It's fantastic.
yeah, and he's covers for the New Yorker and acclaim, making a movie and things like that. And my other son is a environmental activist and a writer also. He's written several books. And when people say, what was your parenting that would support that? And I said, it was my job to stay out of their way. It doesn't mean I didn't give them guidance, but anything that was a sign of passion or real interest or whatever, I just supported that in whatever way I could. I mean, I went fishing on Sunday while I was a doctoral student, so that he could fish. And I got more drawing tablets than any kid could ever use, because I wanted to make sure he never ran out of what he was drawing. So, because I felt like so many people in my community, including myself, and my parents particularly, there's a certain level of anxiety that kept them from really following their passion. And because I looked at my cohort, and there were people that were very talented, gifted artists, musicians, creative folks that were channeled into safe occupations and
Mm.
so that in some ways it would protect their parents, and success meant you did what would keep your parents and your family safe rather than whatever it was I really dreamed about or wanted to be. So we don't have, in my generation, a lot of comedians or actors or musicians or pop stars. But I see it blossoming more in the subsequent generations.
Oh, I love that you're talking about, letting them find their passions, their voices, their own personalities, and really pushing and, like you said, staying out of their way. I love that because you hear a lot of people, right? Especially in Asian cultures where people say, oh, my parents wanted me to be a doctor,
Right.
whatever it is, those successful jobs, and people are not happy in it. So I love that was a priority, a value that you all had, and it's carried forward. And I know a lot of Japanese Americans, especially in my generation, did not grow up fully aware of this awful truth of the situation. And I know that many that lived it, like your parents, don't like sharing about it, like you said. And you share insights in your book into the painfulness of reading your parents' diaries, right? Because this is how this journey really kicked off. And I know you went through this whole train of how you wanted this book to look, or all of that. But you were piecing their story together because they didn't like talking about it. And at that point, right, I think they had already passed, right, by the time that you had gathered everything. And so what was your writing process like? I think it took 20 years, right? As to write all of it and putting it together. What was that like for those that have not read the book yet, so that you can kind of give a flavor to that? And in the moments that felt too painful to write or continue on, what carried you forward?
So the writing process, it's like there was this kind of constant internal struggle because I call it my own neurosis of I carried those boxes. Well, let me back up. So when my father died, that's when we found the letters he had saved, and it was letters from my mother while they were in two separate prison camps, and I shocked, and she was shocked. It was an interesting moment because I handed her this thing that we had taken out of his desk, and it was wrapped up in twine. And she said, "Oh, I didn't know Daddy saved my letters." And I said, and then she said, "Somewhere around here, I saved the letters he sent to me." I said, "Oh my God, okay." And so then I handed the most critical moment, the telling moment was then I handed her the letters. I thought, anyway, I handed to her and she patted them and handed them back to me.
Mhm.
Um, and she didn't want to relive that experience. And so then I was, by the time my mother died, I had found all the letters, 182 letters that they had exchanged while they were in separate prison camps. And I put them in boxes along with, when my father passed away, found his haiku journals. He had been writing poetry since I was a kid. I knew he was a poet, but these were the prison camp poems. And so I packed them in a box. I carried those boxes around for years. I'm kind of afraid, like her in that moment. I felt that there was something she couldn't handle, and therefore I wasn't ready until the right moment. And I kept feeling like I need. So they were partly educated in Japan when they were young, so their letters were mostly written in Japanese, and I couldn't read them. That was part of our intense assimilation after we were released from camp so that we wouldn't stand out as potential enemies. So the process was, in the end, it was therapeutic. In the process, it was, I had a lot of anxiety and fear because that one secret about renouncing their citizenship. I thought, well, how many more secrets are there? And so finding a translator at the right moment when I was ready was all, from that point on, so much synchronicity, almost as if this was now the time and just start moving forward. And so parts of the book I wrote early on while I was in the middle of the translation, trying to recover pieces of what my mother or father said about their early childhood. And I couldn't write those in any kind of linear chronological fashion because they were remnants. So I found kind of a poetic form, although I don't identify myself as a poet, to try and capture the moment that they had shared with me. So once the translator, she was perfect. She was a graduate student from Japan, studying psychology with me, and so she could capture the nuances through the Japanese language and make these translations that were so beautifully rendered. And there were moments where my own issues were always kind of right there as the unfolding was happening. And a critical moment was, so she would sit, and I started this book before I had a computer, so this was on a word processor. She would sit next to me and take out each envelope, open each envelope and take each letter out. And she could sight read and translate at the same time. And then I would type what she was saying to me. And we had barely gotten into it. And she paused and was kind of stumbling with her words. And I looked at her and she was crying. And my reaction was to be angry. And I reached over on her shoulder and I said, Iko, if I'm going to get through this, you cannot cry. And she looked up at me in shock, and we both started to sob because we were reading now my mother's diary. And then I realized in that moment that I need to sob my way through this whole process because there have been too many tears that weren't shed because we had to defend against the pain, but also, my parents had to take care of us and survive. And so everything got kind of locked away. And then we gathered ourselves and got back to work. And she started to read my father's haiku that he was writing to my mother. And there was a line in there that said, as I'm writing to you, I can see the autumn leaves falling through the window. And then we looked out the window of my office and there were autumn leaves falling. And we both started crying again. I'm laughing because it was joyful tears almost, like, okay, finally I could just be real. I could just be open. Do this writing with your heart open rather than being a chronicalist or, a memoirist. Just be in this process. And so there's a lot of my heart in that book because of that moment. Yeah.
And I know as I was kind of like flipping back through what I had put tabs on, you even share about how your name, right? Like taking back your name, using your given name that you didn't even know was actually your given name because the name had changed to become more Americanized and to fit in and all these things. Can you share a little bit about that?
Sure. I was at some point in my 30s, and for all those years, when we were released from the prison camp, we went to Cincinnati, Ohio, and the teachers told my parents, because I asked them, how did this happen? But the teachers said, if your children are going to be real Americans, they need to have real American names. So we're going to call Kiyoshi, my older brother, Kenny, and we're going to call her Satsuki, we're going to call her Sandy. So until I was in my 30s, I was called Sandy. I'm working on a children's book right now called My Name Is Not Sandy, to,
Oh,
encourage children to keep their unique names. So, my father was a poet, so he spent a lot of time deciding the names of his children. And I could imagine what it must have felt like for him. Because Satsuki means child of the fifth moon. I was born in May. And so I reclaimed my name, and everybody went along. My father could tell it made a huge difference for him. But my mother said to me, "Don't do it. Bad things will happen." That was a repeated phrase from her. And from my father's repeated phrase was, "Be strong, don't cry." So to me, those phrases are still tinged with the trauma about how to survive in the face of threat and danger. But by then, I felt like, no, I wanted my real name. I wanted to reclaim it. And even my friends, sanseis also would make fun and say, "Oh, you're trying to be more Japanese," or whatever. And but in the face of that, I felt so much better. I felt like, in some ways, more congruent and able to claim and really inhabit that Japanese part of me, rather than the part that had to be kind of cut away to make space for survival. Yeah.
and even in that story, I feel like I see a lot of your mom, in which you share here. You came to realize as you were reading her diaries and letters that she was this really strong woman, even though she was quiet, right? Which I think we see that in a lot of Japanese women. But especially as you're reading the excerpts where she was the one with the kids, two infants, well, infant and a toddler, in a prison camp while her husband is somewhere else, right, in a different camp, going through all these things. You guys got chicken pox. You guys got all the things. gave birth, right? All these things, and she did. And even if in one of the letters, right, she says, "Oh, you must be doing well by yourself in this other camp." And I giggled at that, but also went, I cannot imagine doing this by yourself. All the unknowns in this tiny, like, that you don't have the space, all the comforts. What were your thoughts as you were looking back on your mom and all that she went through navigating?
Yeah, I always thought of my mother growing up. I always thought of her as a quiet, accommodating person. She was a very loving mother, in a very Japanese way. She wasn't physically affectionate as much as I wanted her to be. But I, when I reflect back on what she went through, I realized that I too was a single mom with two kids. And I drew strength. I don't think I consciously knew that. I drew strength from what she went through. So when I was writing many years later, I feel like her persistence, her devotion to her kids was something that I had internalized. And that helped me get through being a single mom for many years. And Shizuko is her name, and Shizuko means quiet child. And, they had a very somewhat traditional marriage. And my father was also quiet, but he was the master of the household. She catered to him. And he was, very internal. He was a poet, and he would, it's not anything he shared with us. It's something he just did. We'd be somewhere on a trip or something, and he would step away, and I could see him taking out of his pocket a little notebook, and he'd be jotting things down. And later on, I figured out that's what he was doing. So, um, yeah, I kind of lost track of what you were asking me. Sorry.
No, that's perfect. We were just talking about how you process through what your mom went through, right? And how that has affected you. And I know you've talked about this before in other interviews as well, where you are angry, right? There is anger, but there is a channeling of that into all these good things that you have done to help people understand, to bring this to the surface so that's not hidden, so that it is not repeated in history again, as much as we can do about that, right? So how did you come to channel that for good? And can we talk a little bit about what is going on now and how we can step into more of those things that, even though it might not be for our direct people group, there's a lot of injustice that is still happening that we need to come alongside other people for.
Right.
So how did you come into that?
It's interesting, and it is what I want to urge other people to consider. But I, I was spending a lot of time complaining about what was going on in this country, and you know, uh, whining about it. And then I got a phone call from a young Yonsei, fourth generation Japanese American, Carl Takei, who was with the ACLU at that time, and his mother was a friend of mine, and he said, "I'm working for the National Prisons Project with ACLU. We are concerned about what's happening to the children who are being detained, and would I be willing to go undercover for the ACLU as a religious visitor, because it's the only people that could go inside these detention camps. And we want to get an assessment of how the children are coping, what's going on for the children." And I don't know, I felt like kind of a jolt of electricity went through me, and I said, "Yes, when do you want me to be there?" And it was like within 2 days I was there. And I got to go in as if, and I don't speak Spanish or any of the languages of the Central American people, that the mothers and children that were held at this prison site. So they attached a priest to me to do the translation. And we had to act as if he wasn't translating for me, because you had to be Spanish speaking religious visitor to be able to be permitted to go in. So I met with several mothers and children, and I went back. And what I witnessed was so painful, and the injustice was so shocking. How the people were being treated. You know, there are many examples, but the one was the mother said that her daughter's lost a lot of weight because she can't eat the food. And so I asked the little girl with the translator. We had our backs to the officer that was guarding us. And I said, "Well, why aren't you eating?" And she said, "It's too salty." And I looked at the mother, and she said, "Actually, it's not salt. They pour pepper all over our food, excessive amounts of pepper." And the mothers asked the guard, "Why do you have to put so much pepper on the food?" And the guard looked at her and said, "This is so you'll tell your relatives not to come here." And I'm thinking about this child losing weight because she can't eat, and just the inhumane ways that they were treated. The drinking water was bad. I asked later on what was causing the bad water, because I noticed the officers, the guards, were all had bottles hanging from their belts of water. And when we stepped outside, the priest said, "Look around. What do you see?" I said, "I don't know. What are those what's that equipment? She said, he said, those are fracking machines. And the FDA has said that that water was drinkable. He said, let's go to the water fountain. And it was just smelled like chemicals. But that's the water they were given. So there were many. I could write another book on the things that I learned from them. Yeah, it was awful. So I think rather than being sad and feeling pity, the rage just, and I kept having flashbacks of what I was working on with my parents' story, and the feeling of the one feeling that started to come through in my parents' writings was starting to emerge in me. This anger, this righteous anger, and especially after meeting with the children, it was no longer just a political circumstance that I could whine and complain about. It was something I felt like I had to do. I had to bring those two worlds together and utilize the trauma that we had experienced and the healing that could come from this, which I hadn't realized until later, But I remember at one of our initial protests that we had organized, I found like-minded people, and we decided we needed to show up as Japanese Americans. And I remember specifically being at one of the early sites in South Texas in front of these detention sites that had hundreds of children and mothers. And we're chanting, stop repeating history, never again is now, things like that. And feeling like being angry, but something else was happening. There was this, and maybe it happens to people who just the emotional rush and everything like that. But afterwards, we were talking, and I said, I feel like there's some kind of healing going on. That in using my voice at the top of my lungs, feeling outraged and angry, that there was a feeling of release and gratification that had been unfulfilled, that there was a healing because hardly anybody had stood up for us. Hardly anybody had spoken out. There were no protest actions or anything like that while we were disappeared from our homes and schools. And what that healing did for us was it helped us find each other, talk to each other as Japanese Americans. Second, nisei, sansei, yonsei, gosei. We'd start having these conversations, and at different ways that people had been coping, we found a voice, a unified voice that urged us to organize, to get others together, that we have an important message to give because we have suffered the experience that's being replicated today. So that was the birth of Tsuru for Solidarity, our social justice organization, comprised of more and more younger people, but it started out with people like me who were children in the camps. And we organized in 2019 and continue today. And because of current policies and practices of the administration, we are mobilizing in solidarity with other social justice groups. And we have new hubs just kind of coming up on their own. We're not going around trying to recruit people, but people are reaching out to us, Japanese Americans, saying, there's a group of us that want to be part of what's going on. So our newest hub is in Portland. We have one in Seattle. So Sacramento, they're kind of manifesting on their own. And we're at a place now where we could provide support, training, perspective, strategies for organizing. So it's been, a passion waiting to be fulfilled. Yeah.
And I was not expecting this for myself, but as I was reading it and listening to the stories and also hearing people go back and forth about, well, I want to go back to Japan, but then people hear how bad it is in Japan during that time, right? Because of the war and how it's ravaged. And my dad was born in 45. So I have not heard his story. He does not really talk about it. I think I have steered away, but while I have the opportunity, this has inspired me to do that and tread carefully. But if I can get that experience and understand, and I think it will again connect some dots too, right? Of um, why he is the way he is, certain things that were like told to me, parented. I think that is a valuable thing that I can learn as well. So thank you for that inspiration and just sharing that story, right?
Amy, I wrote this book for you. I mean, I feel a little choked up right now
You do.
because I wanted I wanted people to do exactly what you're saying you want to do, because the trauma is not no one. I didn't never heard anyone say, "Don't ask me about camp," but we get the vibe, the to tread gently, to not break through that, and yet there's a way that if people, if children, adult children, out of love, want to understand and know that there's a healing that's possible just in retelling the story, just sharing it with your child. Um, there is a healing for the next generation after that. Yeah. So thank you for stepping forward and yeah, and
I'm
the
an emotional
tears.
person. I cry. I cry easily, but yeah,
But the tears are part of the healing.
yes.
I mean, can you picture us? We're there standing, chanting, we're wearing our t-shirts, we're yelling at the top of our lungs. We're 80, 70, 80, and 90 years old with our canes and our hearing aids and whatever else we need. And we're crying and laughing. We're
Yeah.
crying and laughing. This release is so intense and so important to open the door to truth and connection. Yeah, yeah. And when I finished writing the book, I think, it took me a long time. I had to do it in segments for many reasons, but mostly emotional. I felt there was a healing for me in knowing what they went through, and the anger was my weapon now that I could use to get more courage to step out and step forward and speak out and showing up in ways that I might never have done. Yeah.
We always like to end with a challenge or some sort of action, small action for people to feel like they can take today, or we talked about a lot of things. I don't want them to be overwhelmed by, oh my gosh, there's so much. I don't know where to start. So, is there something you can leave with people of, if this has moved you, go do this thing? For me, I'm taking away my like story, right? Learning about the story and looking into where I can help with injustice now. But do you have a suggestion for people?
Yeah, I want to just give a little background to that question, because when we were organizing, we were saying, okay, how do we show up? None of us had been organizers before, and Mike Ishii, who is my partner in founding Suda for Solidarity, someone said, we should bring Sudu, folded paper cranes. And I said, we want the children to know that someone outside cares. So let's fold 1,000 cranes and we'll hang it on the fence. And Mike, who is our visionary, said, no, let's fold 10,000 cranes. And so we then started calling our families and friends and everybody and asked them to fold paper cranes, a simple action. And the response to that was an indication to me of people wanting to do something, needing something to do to step forward. And by the time we got to the site where we were going to protest next in South Texas, 30,000 paper cranes had been sent to us from all over Canada, Alaska, Japan, and across the country. 30,000 paper cranes. And some of them had tags on it with their names on it, like they wanted to be known as having done something. And so each one of those paper cranes, we had to string them so we can hang them across the fence. But if one fell off, we picked it up, we dusted it off, we made sure it got attached because it was maybe a child or someone who wanted to do something. So, my challenge is don't sit back and whine like I did about it. Do something. Do something that is uncomfortable for you. It could be calling your representative. It could be writing a letter. It could be showing up at a protest. We're not wanting to people to get hurt or risk their lives necessarily, but do something. Do something and be proud of standing up for what you believe in. Because if we don't, we're in serious trouble. We need everybody who maybe has never done anything. And if you decide to fold a paper crane, you can send it to us. We will string it up. We'll take it to our next protest. And go beyond that. See how that feels. But talk to a neighbor who maybe doesn't understand what's happening and the risk to our democracy that is happening now. Have a conversation, and maybe it's a family member, but step out of your comfort zone. We need you to do that.
And I love that you shared no action is too small, right? You can start with a paper crane and go from there. Conversations. It sounds simple, but sometimes that's the scariest thing, right?
Yeah.
But yeah, we could do that. I love that. For people that want to connect with you further, find out more, where can they go? And we'll have the links in the description as well, but where can people go to
So
find you?
my website is a good place to start. It's www.satsukiina.com. Easy. And there's a way there. There's contact information there.
That sounds great.
Yeah.
Anything else that you want to leave with our audience before we finish out?
No, I want to thank you, Amy. I really appreciate this opportunity, and thanks for taking the time to read the book. And I feel so validated by the fact that you're going to be talking to your dad. Yeah.
And that is also a simple thing you can do, right? You can go read the book, I'll pick it up, read it. I don't know how someone will not be moved after reading it. I get teary every single time I think about it. So thank you so much. It was truly an honor and privilege, and I'm so glad I've had you.
Thank you, Amy.
Thank you, Satsuki.